Suspected of carrying out bomb attacks at the weekend in New York and New Jersey has been taken into custody following a gun battle with police. He's been named as Ahmad Khan Rahami, a 28-year-old US citizen of Afghan descent. He'd been discovered sleeping in a bar doorway. Rahami, along with 2 police officers, was injured during the operation to arrest him. Nick Bryant has more.
This is a suspect who police believe carried out the New York bombing. Blooded and bandaged following a shootout with police, but now in custody after a dramatic manhunt. His name is Ahmad Khan Rahami, a 28-year-old naturalized US citizen who was born in Afghanistan. The police had released photos of him early this morning after he was spotted on surveillance footage at the site of the New York bombing and also where a second device was found just streets away. The public had been warned he was armed and dangerous.
I seen the cops shooting at the guy. From there, that was a history of a bit. About 12 shots rung out. I guess he got him by then.
The morning started with 2 bomb squad robots investigating a suspicious package, which exploded before they could even deactivate it. It had been left near a railway station in the town of Elizabeth, New Jersey, and the blast clearly took detectives by surprise. This is a town where Ahmad Khan Rahami lives, and an investigation quickly turned into a manhunt. The FBI carried out searches at his family's business, a fried chicken restaurant where the authorities say he worked. They've been investigating possible links with a spate of attacks over the weekend. They began on Saturday morning when a pipe bomb exploded ahead of a charity run for Marines in New Jersey. Nobody was injured. That was followed on Saturday evening by an explosion in Chelsea, New York, which injured 29. A second device was found nearby. Both were shrapnel-filled pressure cookers. The same evening, 9 people were stabbed at a Minnesota shopping center by a man of Somali origin who was later shot dead by police. So-called Islamic State has claimed responsibility. And then late yesterday evening, the backpack with explosive devices was found in New Jersey. Speaking in New York, a city that only last week commemorated the attacks of 9/11, the president was defiant.
By showing those who want to do us harm that they will never beat us, by showing the entire world that as Americans we do not and never will give in to fear, that's going to be the most important ingredient in us defeating those who would carry out terrorist acts against us.
On the streets of New York, what authorities are calling the biggest security presence this city has ever seen, with 1,000 additional police officers and National Guardsmen protecting key sites. This week's security was already going to be tight, with more than 130 heads of state and government attending the United Nations General Assembly. But extra precautions are now being taken. But the police clearly believe they now have the New York bombing suspect in custody. One of the questions now, was he a lone wolf or part of a wider plot? Nick Bryant, BBC News, New Jersey.
In the last half hour, New York police have confirmed that they have no reason to think a cell is involved in the attacks. New York's Mayor Bill de Blasio confirmed it was a terror attack.
Based on the information we have now, we have every reason to believe this was an act of terror. We will be going into some detail, and there is still a long investigation ahead, but now we have, as I said, every reason to believe this was an act of terror. In addition, want to note that because this is an ongoing investigation, all New Yorkers should remain vigilant. At any given point, New Yorkers may find a piece of information, hear a conversation, see something that could very much aid the NYPD, the FBI, and our partners. Want all New Yorkers to be vigilant and to provide that information if you get it at any given point in time.
Well, our correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher is in New York for us. Barbara, we've been hearing from officials in the last half an hour. What more have they been telling us?
Well, Regini, they were stressing that this is still very much an active investigation, but you really had a palpable sense of relief from especially the security officials who said the primary focus had been on trying to get the suspect. And now that they had him in custody, they could start looking at what his motivations might have been, whether he acted alone or whether he acted with somebody else. They especially noted that the alert system that had been put out earlier in the day when his photograph was distributed had been very effective They said, as you mentioned, that they didn't have any reason to believe an active terror cell was operating. They said they were not actively looking for another individual, but they were following up with the arrest to find out more information. We also were told by the mayor that the vigilance would continue, the security presence would continue, especially since the UN General Assembly is being held in town at the moment. So he said to watch out for that. And one other detail, Regini, the security officers were asked if this man had been on a terrorist watch list, and as far as they knew, he was not on their radar. There had been some sort of domestic, probably criminal incident, perhaps, but not a terrorist one, and so he hadn't really been flagged up to their attention before this incident, of course.
Barbara Clare-Tusher, thanks very much for joining us with the latest. Well, with me now is James J. Carafano, a leading expert in national security and foreign policy challenges. Thanks very much for joining us. We're getting more information from the FBI. First of all, they say that there is no motive. What leads do you think they will be looking at now? They have a suspect.
Right. So it's not unusual that they wouldn't have any motives up front in a situation like this, but they'll get to that very quickly. So they will interview people, known associates, his family and relatives. They'll say things. They will go through his accommodations, if he has a computer, if he has a cell phone. They'll go through all these records, and from that, they'll begin to piece together motive. Motive is important because it's easy for the mayor to go out and say this is an act of terror. That's different from the statutory requirement to charge somebody with the crime of terrorism, which not only requires an intent or an act of violence, but also that act for a political or social purpose. So they have to tie those two together, intent and act, to make it a statutory said that this is a terrorist act.
Now, they're saying that he wasn't part of any cell, but they have investigated other possible leads. They say in that recent press conference that 5 other people were questioned and are still in custody.
Right. So it's not unusual to question a bunch of people who may or may not be involved in the plot. They just may have some material knowledge, or they may suspect they have some material knowledge. So that's not unusual. So the terms cell and lone wolf are incredibly imprecise and unhelpful terms. There's a difference. You might have a situation where the individual may have acted alone in terms of gathering materials, organizing, and everything else. And we've seen that number. We've had at least 89 Islamist-related terror plots aimed at the United States since 9/11. A number of them have been done by individuals who did everything themselves. But there's a difference between that and nobody knew what they were up to, right? So where you might have associates that they discussed with it, realized he was going to do some kind of radical activity. Somebody was maybe doing mosque shopping. They couldn't find a mosque that was radical enough for them, so they go from one to another, which is an indicator of somebody that's radicalizing. So that will all be determined by the scope of the investigation.
You talk about indicators, but from what we know so far, he wasn't on the radar of any authorities.
Well, again, that's a very imprecise and unhelpful statement. Well, he wasn't on our radar. First of all, you don't know if somebody was on your radar or not because you're going to gather a lot of information now from federal, state, and local agencies. And first you're going to find out, well, what did we know about this individual? Was he truly off the radar screen, which essentially may have been. But then there's another question is, should he have been? Had he talked to people in his community, other people, which might have made him an indicator. So, and again, all that remains to be seen. So.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you can find out more about the unfolding investigation on our website. Just go to bbc.com/news and you can find live updates and analysis from our correspondents here in the US. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel's accepted responsibility for the historic losses suffered by her Christian Democratic Party in Berlin's state elections on Sunday. Calling it a bitter result, Mrs. Merkel conceded that her open-door refugee policy was a factor. The CDU polled under 18% of the vote, but the right-wing anti-migrant party, Alternative for Germany, made big gains and will enter the state parliament for the first time. Here is Angela Merkel speaking at a press conference today.
Auch ich habe mich lange Zeit gerne auf das Dublin-Verfahren verlassen.
I relied for a long time on the Dublin Agreement that, to put it very simply, removed the problem for us Germans. That was not good. If I could, I would turn back time for many, many years to prepare better with the entire government and all those responsible for the situation that hit us unprepared in the summer of 2015.
Well, Jörg Luken is the German editor of online news network The Local. And she joins us now. Now, Jörg, how significant is this for Angela Merkel?
It's significant in the sense that it is the fifth state election of this year in which her party has underperformed. I wouldn't say Berlin is any more important than the other state elections that have happened. It's got more attention because it's Berlin and Berlin is the capital and so forth, but Berlin is actually one of the smaller German states, so in the sense of being representative of the German population, perhaps, is being slightly blown out of proportion at the moment. But of course, it's undoubted that every further defeat in a state election is putting more pressure on Merkel to change her course, to admit guilt in the refugee crisis, which she did for the first time today of a sort, although it wasn't really admitting guilt. It was actually something very different to that. She was basically admitting mistakes that happened before this time last year when they stopped applying the Dublin Agreement.
OK, well, we'll just have to cut that interview. We apologise for the sound quality there, but thank you very much for joining us, Jörg. Now a look at some of the day's other news. A lawyer for Michael Schumacher has told a court in Germany that the former Formula One world champion cannot walk following his skiing injury 2.5 years ago. The revelation came as part of a lawsuit against a German magazine. The magazine had reported that the 7-time world champion could manage some steps with the help of therapists. The most senior Google executive outside Silicon Valley has said that Britain shouldn't be distracted by Brexit and should focus on supporting the growth of global technology companies. Matt Britton, the head of Google's Europe, Middle East and Africa businesses, said the vote to leave the European Union was a local issue and that conditions for success in the technology business were improving. Doubts are increasing over the ceasefire in Syria, with the Syrian army declaring it over. The Syrian military command blamed rebels for repeatedly violating the truce, which started 7 days ago. The rebels have made the same accusations against the Syrian government. Russia said it was senseless for the Syrian army to respect the truce if it's being attacked. Well, Syria's on the minds of world leaders as they arrive in New York, as they decide on how best to deal with Europe's ongoing migrant crisis. Huge numbers of desperate people continue to make the journey from northern Africa and the Middle East, mainly Syria. But the vast majority of those who fled the country have stayed in the region. Of the 2.7 million who are now in Turkey, just under 1.5 million are children. Fewer than 1 in 4 of them are getting any form of education, and many of them are having to work instead. Well, we've been speaking to 2 young boys who are working 6 days a week in factories in eastern Turkey. Caroline Hawley and cameraman Sakir Kader have their story.
هلا أنا بحب مهارتي تكون لاعب كرة قدم أكون مع فريق ريال مدريد هلا صار شغل بس نشتغل نقدم لأهالينا.
Dreams die quickly in war. Like many of the other children working in this shoe factory, 15-year-old Kamil is a Syrian refugee.
هلا أنا وأخوي عم نشتغل بهاي المعمل وعم نقدم لأهلنا بس كنا أول ندرس 12 ساعة باليوم 6 أيام بالأسبوع نشتغل باخذ 250 ليرة بالأسبوع. أنا مشتاق لبلدي مشتاق للحارة كنا ساكنين فيها بس هلا الحارة انضربت نزلت للأرض ما ضل عنا بيت حتى بسوريا ما ضل عنا بيت.
The rest of Kamil's family was planning to flee to Turkey too, but got cut off by fighting around Aleppo.
هلا أنا مشتاق لأهلي للولد والوالدة يكون مع أخوتي بس زمن مر علينا وهن ضلوا هنيك وهلا نحن جينا لهون لحالنا بس يفتح الطريق أهلي بيجوا لعنا ونسكن سوا إن شاء الله.
12-year-old Hussein also works 12-hour shifts in a nearby factory.
الغزايف ما هو يتركونا ضربوا جمنا نزحنا على تركيا كنا بسوريا بدرس كن كيفين كان على مصاري كيفين كلياتنا فيها. أنا راتبي 160 ليرة عم نعيش العيلة ونجيب خضرة وهذا عم نعيش العيلة الحمد لله وعايشين.
This is Hussein's home now. His wages support a family of 6. His father Mohammed was injured in the war.
هو طفل يعني حقه كان يكون يعني غير هالشيء هذا حقه دراسة حقه يعني يعيش غير هالعيشة هاي لكن يعني ما بيطلعش باليد كنت يعني مأمن له مستقبل يعني انه غير الشغل غير هالشيء هذا كنت متأمل له يعني انه يطلع دكتور يطلع شيء شغلة هيك يعني ارفع راسي فيه لكن حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل.
أبوي ما بيشتغل لأني ما حدا بشغله. حلمي أرجع على سوريا وما يتمشي بحلب ولا بسوريا بكلياتها ما يكونوا مرتاحين أحسن من هيك نتم شاشطين التركية من بلد لبلد. إيش نساوي؟ هيك رب العالمين كاتب لنا.
We asked Hussein why he isn't in school.
ما بروح على المدرسة لأني بدي أشتغل. بشتغل بعيش عيلتي من راتبي.
The story there of two boys fleeing the conflict in Syria. Well, the BBC's Laura Trevelyan is at the United Nations. Laura, a busy week ahead as world leaders gather there in New York. What is likely to dominate the agenda?
Well, Regina, today the UN held its first ever summit on refugees and migrants. This is a theme that will continue through the week. Tomorrow the US President Barack Obama is hosting a refugee summit. And of course, the overarching theme of all of this is Syria and that war now in its 6th year, which is causing this global refugee crisis. More than 5 million people who have fled Syria, even more displaced within its borders. So if you like, that's the theme. And today there's been criticism of the document that world leaders came up with. It isn't that specific. It calls for a compact on refugees and a different compact on migrants to be agreed within 2 years. The UN Secretary General had urged world leaders to agree that 10% of the globe's refugees should be resettled annually. But that was a figure that world leaders couldn't agree on today. So all eyes really on tomorrow and what's expected to be a more specific refugee summit from the US, because it's in a lot of ways pay to play. You can't go to that summit unless you're prepared to pony up money or resettle more refugees.
And of course, staying with Syria, Laura, what is the latest on that ceasefire, which is hanging on a thread?
I spoke earlier to the United States ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, about exactly that. And of course, reports are coming through. People are having hundreds of meetings here. They're reading reports of what's happening in Syria. People are just trying to process what seems to be happening. But her response was very much that it's on the side of the Russians, who are of course the ally of the Syrians, that the Russians need to clarify exactly what the Syrian position is. But that US-Russian brokered ceasefire, which started 7 days ago, there was always mistrust on both sides. So I think the worry for everyone here is that if it is the case that that ceasefire has collapsed after only a week, well, what does that mean for hopes to settle the crisis? What does that mean for hopes to end the war? Nothing good.
And Laura, just very quickly, what is the security atmosphere in New York at the moment?
Well, it's extremely heightened security, Regina. Just when I went now to get a coffee, I went past an NYPD truck which had 20 SWAT team members coming out, absolutely bristling with kit, which is not a sight actually that you normally see here at the UN General Assembly. The security here, although it's visible, it's not normally quite at that level. So that's a sign of the 1,000 additional police and National Guard officers who are being deployed in the wake of that bombing in Chelsea at the weekend. And people here definitely following all the developments in New York and New Jersey as they unfold.
Well, Laura Trevelyan, thank you very much. Now, in Russia, President Putin's tightened his grip on power after parliamentary elections. But the turnout's been described as the lowest in the country's modern history. There have also been claims of vote-rigging violations at some polling stations. Our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg reports.
In Moscow today, they announced a Kremlin landslide. President Putin's party had won 3/4 of the seats in parliament. But there are reports of election fraud. Russia's election chief promised to investigate thoroughly and quickly. This video is from a polling station's CCTV camera. Watch the official who's seated. Thinking that no one is looking, she takes a pile of ballot papers. The woman in black tries to cover her as she stands at the ballot box and stuffs them in. It's a similar picture at this polling station. Another official who appears to be stuffing the ballot box. Here, Russian police have opened a criminal case. But Vladimir Putin can afford to look pleased. Perhaps more than anything, it's his personal popularity in Russia, his 80% approval rating, which helped the party he created win by such a large margin. This election was about more than just electing a new parliament. It was about the president, too. In a year and a half's time, Russians go to the polls to choose a new leader. And with his party having done so well in this vote, Vladimir Putin is almost certain to run for a fourth term in the Kremlin. Unlike the last election, fraud at the polls hasn't sparked protests on the street. I'm worried by reports of violations, she says, but I think the authorities are trying to clamp down on this. What good would protesting do, he says. The last time people did that, some of them were taken to court. This victory leaves Putin more powerful than ever. Don't expect him to quit the Russian stage anytime soon. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Well, Game of Thrones has once again ruled over American television's most prestigious awards ceremony, the Emmys. The hugely popular fantasy show won Best Drama Series and 11 other awards. The People vs. O.J. Simpson, an American crime story, also had a good night. And our very own colleagues at the BBC also picked up some awards. With the story of the night, Peter Bowes reports from Los Angeles.
Television's biggest night on one of Hollywood's hottest days. Basking in the sun and the spotlight, some of TV's best-known faces. The dramatisation of a court case that gripped America more than 20 years ago dominated the show. The People vs. O.J. Simpson, American crime story, was named Best Series. Several of its stars also received Emmys, including Sarah Paulson, who played the prosecutor Marcia Clark, once a figure of ridicule in America.
The more I learned about the real Marcia Clark, not the two-dimensional cardboard cutout I saw on the news, the more I had to recognize that I, along with the rest of the world, had been superficial and careless in my judgment, and I'm glad to be able to stand here today in front of everyone and tell you I'm sorry.
There were also Emmys for BBC productions. Suzanne Bier was honoured for directing the crime drama The Night Manager, while Sherlock, The Abominable Bride, was named Best TV Movie.
I would like to thank in some detail now, but I'm not going to because it's been a long night and they're all British, so I'll just go home and phone them.
Dame Maggie Smith had already become the butt of a joke about not turning up for the show when her name came out of the envelope for Downton Abbey.
Maggie, if you want this, it will be in the Lost and Found. Game of Thrones.
But with a total of 38 wins over the years, Game of Thrones is the biggest winner of all. It's now the most decorated narrative series in history. Peter Bowes, BBC News, Los Angeles.
And before we go, we wanted to show you these amazing pictures from the Triathlon World Series in Mexico. Britain's Johnny Brownlee was leading in the closing stages and was set to claim his second world title when he almost collapsed on the course. His brother, Olympic champion Alistair, who was in third place, managed to help Johnny over the last half a kilometre before quite literally throwing him across the finish line. He didn't win the race in the end and was beaten to first place by South African Henri Schoeman. But Johnny tweeted a photo of himself in hospital after the race and said, "Not how I wanted to end the season, but I gave it everything. Thanks, Alistair. Your loyalty is incredible." Well, you can see more on this story on Sport Today here on BBC World News. A reminder of our top story. A man wanted in connection with bomb attacks at the weekend in New York and New Jersey has been taken into custody after exchanging gunfire with police. He's been named as Ahmad Khan Rahami, a 28-year-old US citizen of Afghan descent. In the last hour, the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, said there was every reason to believe the attacks were an act of terror. President Obama urged people to remain calm. Well, you can find more about these unfolding attacks and the investigation on our website. You can go to bbc.com/news and you can find live updates and analysis from all our correspondents here in the United States. Well, that's all from the programme. Next, we have the weather. For now, me, Regina Vaidyanathan, and the rest of the team, thanks very much for joining us.